Bene, invitiamo i partecipanti ad accomodarsi. Per evitare le pratiche italiane dei ritardi.
So, at an international conference, we have to follow criteria of international punctuality. So, we've got our last talk, and after which there will be time for discussion, debate. So I imagine that you will have questions to put to the speakers or considerations. I hope there will be a lively debate.
Bene.
Good.
Siamo quindi all'ultima esperienza di oggi.
So we've come to the final experience of the day. We've already mentioned it that when we introduced Bishop Kapani, the data concerning consecrated life, because we have one of those experiences that come from the Netherlands of the management of ecclesial cultural heritage that was mentioned also in the questionnaire that was put to communities preparing for this event. So you're going to speak in English.
Approach to ensure meaning and the future of orders and congregations in Flanders. E sono venuti a presentarci questa organizzazione, questa esperienza.
So, Julie Aerts got a master's degree in modern history at the Catholic University of Leuven, and she's responsible for dialogue processes within the PARCUM Museum. And we've got Jonas Danckers with us. So I won't mention his entire CV. He's Italian. You can also interview him in Italian language if you wish after his talk, because he has done studies here at the Bologna University, from which I too come. His doctorate and research in archaeology and he was studying the terra mare and not ecclesial heritage, but he is also concerned with diocesan heritage, not only the houses of the religious life, but also the diocesan properties. So thank you very much, and I will hand over to them.
Thanks, Professor Bartolomé, for the introduction, and thanks to you to have waited until the last presentation. We're very happy to take you further away from Rome, more to the north, and more in particular to Flanders, the northern part of Belgium. And Julie Aerts, my colleague, and myself will introduce you very briefly to the current state of religious life, more particularly the life of religious communities in Flanders, and how we proceed with PARCUM, our organization, to help them to think about their future, their buildings, their objects, and their charism, where we have talk about these days. This is the area where we're working, so in dark green, the northern part of Belgium, the Flemish-speaking, the Dutch-speaking part of our country. and one of the many orders and congregations, local communities we are working on. Very shortly, a brief word on our organization, PARCUM.
So we are PARCUM, we are a museum and center of expertise for religious art and culture in Flanders. We were founded in 1997 by the Flemish dioceses, the Organization of Religious Orders and Congregations, the Order of Prémontré, the Norbertine Fathers, the Catholic University of Leuven. But we were also recognized by the Flemish government as a center of expertise and a museum. The immediate reason for the foundation of PARCUM was the safeguarding of the heritage of religious orders and congregations. So an urgent reason, and it was very interesting at that point to do it. We work with an integral heritage approach, so that means that we work for all aspects of religious heritage, which means immovable, movable, and intangible, but we will explain this later. We have a museum which is situated in Park Abbey, a Norbertine Abbey of Prémontré in Leuven in Belgium. The abbey was founded in the 12th century. And there we also focus on dialogue and the meaning of religious heritage in today's society, which is super diverse and multi-religious, to tell the story of this heritage in this context.
Okay. About religious life in Flanders today, especially the life of religious communities, we have around 5,000 religious men and women today in Flanders on a total population of nearly 6 million. So what is very important is that we are working in a very secularized context, and that during the last years we got a drastic decrease of the number of orders and congregations and of these small or larger communities. Very briefly, some history about these religious communities. Of course, we have them already from the medieval period in the 11th and 12th century. A lot of new orders like the Cistercians, Franciscans, Norbertines, we are in the Norbertine Abbey, who were founded in our region. A lot of religious heritage, a lot of communities which were founded, and where we see also a fault line in the 16th century, where between Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the Netherlands, or the Low Countries, were divided between a Protestant north and a Catholic southern part. So where actual Flanders was becoming the southern Netherlands under Spanish and later Austrian rule. So let's say a Catholic region in comparison to our northern neighbors, where, for instance, in the 17th century we got the construction of this Baroque Basilic of Scherpenheuvel, let's say a Catholic bastion, linked, for instance, to the Archdukes of Albrecht, Albert, and Isabella. Just waiting for the slide. We got a very difficult period, tension between church and state, and we heard already about it in the 18th century, first with Joseph II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who started with the Edict of Tolerance and closed a series of contemplative religious institutions, but also more than a decade later, the application of the principles of the French Revolution in our region, where a lot of abbeys and monasteries were closed and even demolished, like the Abbey of Villers-la-Ville we saw already before. And afterwards, Napoleon, who tried to find a solution between this tension between state and church, for instance, with the recognition of the hospital sisters as a public institution, who were, according to Napoleon, more useful than the mere contemplative orders. But then, of course, if we look to the broader history, we got the defeat of Napoleon also in Waterloo in Belgium, and the foundation of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, during which period we had problems with the freedom of religion. It's only at the beginning of the new state of Belgium in 1830 that there is a regained freedom of religion, and that religious communities get a very strong increase during the 19th century. So many new congregations are founded, many new monasteries are opened and built, which continues into the 20th century, a very strong impact of Catholicism on Flemish society, on daily life in our region. And then, like other parts of Western Europe, we see after the Second World War a very strong secularization, which becomes very visible now the last 2 decades, with a drastic decrease in the numbers of religious men and women, and especially also in the new vocations. So where do we stand today? And we're not talking about the issue of parish churches, which is also a very critical theme linked to the secularization, but concerning religious life with religious communities. We're now at the number of nearly 5,000 religious men and women, but if you see to the numbers on the slide, we're coming from, in 20 years' time, from 10,000 to 5,000, so nearly half. And during the last years, we see nearly 500 religious men or women we're losing every year. So if we continue according to that rate, we know that we will have serious problems in the years to come. So a lot of houses were closed since 2013, for instance, more than 300 houses were closed, so in the last 9 years. Decreasing number of religious vocations, of course, but also the aging of the members of these religious institutes. Most of them are, according to the statistics, now aged over 80. So the care for the elderly of these congregations and orders became a very central concern during the last years. This is a photo of all religious men and women from my own village where I grew up, taken in 1963. But if we continue to count with the number of 500 a year that on a Flemish level we're losing, we know that towards 2030 nearly no religious houses will remain. Of course, we will always remain some of them, but this means that of the 700 houses that we still have today, a lot of them will close and we'll have to look for a new future in the near future.
So this seems to be a big crisis, but it's also, maybe it's a chance, a new opportunity. This big impact of secularization is not only negative, there are also other aspects. For example, the challenge about thinking actively about passing the soul of the place, what is really the charism, where we've been talking about these days, to the next generation, and also finding an equilibrium between this charism, this soul of the place, and achievable good management, because the care for the elderly is very important for the congregations and the monasteries. It has to be a financially viable plan. So actually, it's this, like telling the message of the charism to a wider public and to next generations, and find something that is really important. And then this charism, the spirit of the place, find its material and immaterial expression in religious heritage, as we have already heard in this presentation. So the starting point is the charism. It means that we have to define the inspiration and the strength, the spirit of a place. It's kind of a research, it's a study of what is now the spirit of this place, what is its particular charism. It's actually what we call the spiritual testament of an order or a congregation. And the spirit of the place is formed of the historical background and the heritage. It's something from the present we want to pass to the future. And therefore we have this integral approach. We have all kinds of heritage, movable, immovable, intangible and immovable, and it all goes together. We should not split them up.
So an approach which we developed as an organization is to integrate the different aspects of heritage in looking for the definition of the charism of that specific congregation or place. So the integration of the immovable heritage to define what is the history and the state of the buildings, combined with a focus on the movable heritage, so making good inventory of the objects of the collections, and the documentation of the intangible heritage. The integration of the three parts is very crucial to define the charism, to define the core of the spiritual significance that the local community has and which we want to transmit to the future. Very important is to think always about the final goal for which we make the inventory. So we're not making an inventory for the inventory, but we try to make an inventory to rethink the monastery, to rethink the place and give it a good future. We're making an inventory of the collections in order to tell the story behind the objects or their significance, and the same for the traditions. Concerning the movable heritage, are we encouraging local communities to make an inventory of their movable heritage, to insert photos and descriptions in a digital database in order to compare them, but also in order to, in the next step, to value these objects and collections. And with valuing, we're not intending valuing it financially, but especially looking to the social, religious and emotional values of these collections in order to define very good the stories and the significance behind the collections, and that helps to define the spirit of the place which we want to preserve also to the next generation.
Another part are archives and libraries. For this part, we collaborate with the colleagues of KDK Leuven, who we have heard yesterday. So that's also an important part, but we won't talk about it today. And then there is the intangible heritage, the living practices and traditions, which are qualified to the 5 UNESCO domains, as Professor Komans already explained us in an earlier presentation, how these domains are structured and about the UNESCO 2003 convention. So there are several domains, and intangible heritage is actually very important for monasteries and convents because it's key to the spirit of the place. Some examples of monastic heritage we have. The liturgy of the hours is very important. It's like the spirit, literally, of a religious congregation or a monastery, but also processions. In some monasteries, they had a monastic sign language. There is kind of crafts like baking hosts, but also embroidering liturgical vestments, making cheese, making beer, painting icons. And this we can also see in the same line as the liturgy of the hours. It's another way of praying. It's another way of living this contemplative vocation. The use of bells, how are bells used nowadays? Organization systems, or the meaning of silence, are all examples of this intangible monastic heritage, these living practices still today. How can we safeguard them for the future? First of all, we have to identify and document these different forms of intangible heritage. We can do it, for example, by interviews, interviewing the religious nuns and fathers, the monks, everyone, because they're the one who live it. So they're very important, these interviews, to have information, oral history, but also documentaries, for example. Sound and film recording is a very good way to preserve the intangible heritage for the future and to make sure that this knowledge is not lost. Here on the picture, for example, you see the Trappist Sisters of Brecht. They are known in Belgium because they make soap, and we are now doing a project with several of these communities to make a documentary and to see how do they do it, what is the meaning behind, they explain, and it's very beautiful to do it that way and to explain and to keep the knowledge. Yeah, the hosts, here, for example, this is a monastery in Bocholt, Belgium, where they still make fabric for liturgical vestments. And also, not only documenting intangible heritage, but also transmission, future. It's a key factor for understanding monastic life and the spirit of the place. We cannot understand it because if we just look at the monastery without this intangible heritage, it are stones. There is no life. It's a source of inspiration also for future use of a religious site. If we have a good documentation and there is a reuse, this can be an inspiration to have a reuse in the spirit of the place. And the idea is it's also very important to pass it on to future generations with respect for core elements, but also looking for new opportunities.
So in our approach, we're focusing on the movable and the intangible heritage, but especially also on the immovable heritage. So we're documenting together with the local communities the history and the architectural significance and the state of these buildings, and looking together also with specialized architects for a good equilibrium between a financial model with which it is possible to continue the management of the site and the charism, the typical spirit of the place of this religious community. Of course, we cannot work on every place or spiritual community in Flanders, so we have a lot of examples in different directions. Some of the monasteries also demolished. We have some of them which get a complete reuse but without religious significance. We have monasteries that go to the private market or are reused. For instance, this example, which becomes a co-housing project for people above 50 years old. It's a former Carmelite cloister, but also many smaller monasteries on the countryside who get a reuse in line with the apostolic mission, for instance here, education of the congregation. Sometimes there is also a reinterpretation of the spiritual testament of the local community, local religious community, and they're with a lot of creativity, they're looking for a new spiritual way of, in this case, trying to contact younger people. The bigger abbeys and monasteries are still continuing and do not always have the need to be supported, like the Abbey of Averbode, for instance. But we have some other projects where they ask help to try to develop a new model, to find the equilibrium between a good financial model and the spirit of the place. And very briefly, we give some examples. This is a site in Dist of the Crutch Friars with their church, where we did an extensive study to look how the church could be integrated in the largest site of the monastery, where they will develop a psychiatric center and an elderly house for people who need some rest and care. But it takes some time. Most of the time, some projects would take more than 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So in the meantime, for instance, in this church, there was last year a pop-up bar. So even in the meantime, between the city and the local owner, they did something else, but there is something programmed on the larger term. The Abbey of Parc, where our museum and offices are located, is a very good example where a combination of partners looked for a continuation of the religious core of the site, and they're still living Norbertine fathers on the site, but besides, the city of Leuven renovated together with the Flemish government this site and get a lot of functions on the site, like a restaurant, but also offices for the university, conference hall, private partners, a farm and a shop which is linked to the farm. So a very diverse set of partners who continue as well the religious as the more secular aspects of this religious site.
Another example is St. Godelieve Abbey in Bruges. It's a beautiful monastery. It was Benedictine, but the last Benedictine nuns went to a home for elderly because they needed care. So Visit Flanders, a touristic agency of the Flemish government, bought the monastery and asked PARCUM help for documenting movable and intangible heritage. We made the inventory of the objects, and we also did a research on the intangible heritage, which the sisters lived there when they were still living there. So yeah, we did this study, for example, on how did they live the liturgy of the hours, what crafts did they do, how was their how did they live silence, and all these things were an inspiration for the new use, because there was an intensive traject of participation of stakeholders and local communities during summer. The Abbey was open to the broad public. They could all come and visit it, and they could also give their opinion on the future use of the place. And this input was used by Visit Flanders to define the spirit of the place. So there will be a future project based on the spirit of the place and on the meaning of the heritage.
And then the last example to finish is this site of Mariadal, or Val Virginal in French. It's a very big site to the east of Brussels, near Tienen. More than 4 hectares with very big buildings, lakes around this site. Already in the 19th century, this was a school in the first place for elite, even coming from outside. But nowadays, a school for children who have special needs, where children from the broader region are coming. It was the apostolate of the sisters and the wish of continuing also that aspect on the site. So we helped them to document all the different aspects, so the intangible heritage, the movable heritage, and the state of the buildings. The buildings in red are the parts of the site where the sisters are living at the moment, but there's still 5 sisters divided in 2 communities. So they really want to think what will become the function of the site after the last sister will die. So it's a very urgent project. They're very enthusiastic to think together with all the partners about the future of the site. After the interviews with the sisters, we defined also the heritage values of the different parts of this site, like the very beautiful Baroque chapel. And we decided together with the school, with the sisters and the local municipality, that we want to make a project together where we will create a new place where a small museum will tell the story of the sisters, so more than 200 years of history, where the school can continue its social function, and where beside that there will be also service flats, so care in apartments for the sisters themselves, but also for other people.
Thank you.
To conclude,
Just a brief conclusion. So this was the situation of the religious life in Flanders. It is critical. Many houses are closing or will close, but it is very important to save their treasure, their charism, the spirit of the place. So we have to take action. It's very important, cataloging. We already have spoken about cataloging during this conference, documenting the heritage. That's crucial, and we should not wait for that, because then we will be too late. The challenge is finding an equilibrium between the management, the good care for the elderly, for the people, and passing on the charism, the soul of the place, because both take energy from the communities. Defining this charism we do by having an integrated, holistic heritage approach. Don't split everything up. And of course, when we do this immovable, movable, and intangible heritage, we want to link it to a feasible financial model. So it's really necessary to make the inventories in time, to define the charism, and in order to safeguard this treasure, this beauty of monastic and religious life. Thank you for your attention.